He previously worked in public policy in Washington, D.C., ran communications operations for a $500 million private foundation, and served as a fellow at the John Jay Institute. His research and cultural commentary have been published in the New Atlantis, Real Clear Politics, The Daily Beast, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, The Statesman, and other books, major newspapers, and blogs. Brian, like many of our other speakers, is a graduate of Princeton University, and you can continue the conversation with him on Twitter at BrianBrownSF. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Brian Lawrence Brown.
Some have asked whether the SF is for social fundraiser or San Francisco, and I said yes. I grew up in Sunnyvale, not far from here, actually, going to Stanford football games, so it's great to come back to campus. On top of that, I'm very dissatisfied with the marriage conversation that our country has had to date. I'm dissatisfied with the way that, in some ways, the way that same-sex issues have been handled by the right, almost as much as I am of their use of social technologies. So I'm happy to have an opportunity to chat with you guys. I've had some fantastic conversations over this side of the room, by the way, so thank you all for getting me all warmed up. Plus, although Ryan and Sharif and I were all at Princeton at the same time, I have a slightly lower opinion of the power of human reason than they do. So I'm glad that I get almost the last word. This is a breakout session, so I know we have to work with the mics, but I'll try to keep this as interactive and informal as I can. There are a couple of points where I'll need to explain some concepts, but largely speaking, I'd like this to be as much of a conversation as we can make it. I'll try to pause for breath at some helpful points, and if I don't, you can make note of a question or idea and bring it up later. Let's start in a weird place. How many of you have seen 3 or more animated Disney movies? Exactly, okay. Favorites? Just sing out. You're just sucking up because it was on a slide. There's a reason I bring this up, and I'll get to it in a moment. But just as an example of where I'm going with this, Little Mermaid. I don't think I heard anyone say that. A lot of people say that. Not guys, mostly. But as I'm almost 30 years old, I'm firmly in the middle of the millennial generation, and like most millennials, I grew up watching these Disney movies, and Little Mermaid was smack dab in the middle of my childhood. Like many Disney movies, it taught kids that love is a feeling that must be acted on at all costs. I would say even more simply, it taught that following your heart is always the right thing to do, both echoing and informing baby boomer / Gen X parenting. I think it's an awesome movie. I mean, how often do you get to watch a movie where the moral of the story is if you defy your father and sell your soul to the devil, you will live happily ever after? But I mean, note that the ethos of this movie, following your heart is always the right thing to do. There's no room in this ethos for a concept like the common good. There's no room in it for the idea that your fleeting inclination might be wrong. Contrast this with Frozen. I really liked Frozen. I know some conservatives have been bashing it. I wrote a blog post taking issue with some of the bashing, and it got 14,000 likes on Facebook within a week, so somebody agrees with me. But Frozen's fascinating because it starts with the Little Mermaid premise, the girl who's found someone that she met 5 minutes ago and decided after 4 minutes that she's going to marry, and makes her announcement and is told that she can't follow her fleeting inclination. And so she throws caution to the winds and is willing to sacrifice everything to follow that inclination. And the message of Frozen, a huge part of the underlying moral thrust of Frozen is the story of this character learning that when you follow your fleeting inclinations, regardless of consequences, sometimes the consequences are pretty darn serious. I can't help but wonder if Disney had been making movies like that for 30 years, whether we might be having a different conversation today. But we're not going to talk in this session about how to win a legal battle, how to beat somebody over the head with an argument. I want to talk about what the future of the conversation looks like and how to be productive contributors to it. Specifically how Instagram, Facebook, and the psychology behind them have affected things on the marriage front and how we can deal with them. Before we can do that, however, we have to explore how we got here in terms of how the marriage issue has been framed. And I am incredibly lucky because I've been preceded by Timothy, by Dr. Lopez, who have set me up on this really, really well. If a first principle of the conversation now, though, as far as I know, nobody has ever accomplished anything by making more sense than the other side. You can take issue with me in the Q&A, but I'm going to throw that out there as a first principle of this conversation. Conservatives often think otherwise. I worked at the Heritage Foundation for a couple of years, and I heard this there all the time, this idea, we have better ideas, and sooner or later, better ideas win. Since when? That has not been my experience, no offense. But let's look at how we got from gay marriage is unfathomable in 2003 to gay marriage is inevitable in 2013. Through the 90s, the cultural strategy, to the extent that there was one, on the gay marriage issue had been to convince people that gay people are normal. They're like us, and with limited success. Then, it's very fascinating. If you look at the numbers of people who support redefining marriage in 2003 and 2013, the numbers are not radically different in Generation X and the Boomer generation, the World War II generation. The one where it's really different is the Millennial generation, where it goes from 51% in 2003 to 70% today. Other generations have had some change, but Millennials just shot up. So what happened? The marriage revision strategy over the last decade focused primarily on appealing to two narratives, two value sets, two ways of understanding the world that every millennial was going to grasp. If you make a claim to somebody appealing to one of these narratives, it's very, very difficult to refute it, especially with a millennial. One of these narratives is an American one, the concept of being able to live as you choose, to not be repressed because of who you are. And I'm sure you've all heard the examples. People who oppose gay marriage are un-American, like the Jim Crow South. And the other one, and this is why I started the way I did, is a Disney one. If you oppose gay marriage, you are Triton in The Little Mermaid. You are the grumpy person who's standing in the way of someone else's dreams. Without making a comment on the pros or cons of the cause, this is the narrative that was appealed to. And we grew up watching these movies that sunk this narrative into us, completely independent of a specific political issue. And this goes back to what Timothy was saying about persuasion. These narratives worked. Somebody appealing to this narrative is going to resonate with most millennials, not because of a particular movie they saw that had a takeaway message, but because the underlying values, the moments, had been imprinted in their imaginations. As a result of the success of this strategy, I would argue there is no debate on the question of redefining marriage. I know someone's going to take an issue with that one. But our conversation about both marriage and same-sex issues in general is tightly restricted by these two claims and the narratives behind them. Any appeals to Triton's values just don't hold water. You're still the bad guy. This is not healthy because there are, as we've heard from other speakers this afternoon, there are serious issues just under the surface of our current conversation that we're not having. This situation is not the case in other countries that haven't experienced the exact same narrative strategy, the exact same messaging strategy, and I'm going to keep just sucking up to the previous speakers and pay tribute to Dr. Lopez on this one because most of what I know of same-sex conversations in France comes from some of the things that he's written. They've had in some ways, some very, very different conversations for the simple reason that, and I'm probably oversimplifying this, that their cultural conversation has not been shaped by the same tightly woven narrative. Even looking at a lot of the next generation sexual ethics issues domestically, like surrogacy, sperm banks, egg donation, and so on, where they haven't really touched the same-sex conversation narrative yet, you can see a lot of prominent feminists, including Patricia Ireland, Sonia Pressman-Fuentes, strongly opposing a lot of the technologies, or at any rate urging extreme caution around them because of the effects that there's some evidence they have on women and children. The marriage revision lobby has strongly sought to suppress discussion about those issues in some cases, but I'm sure nobody at this conference has had any personal experience with such groups trying to suppress conversation. Sooner or later, we're going to have these conversations. Sooner or later, we're going to have conversations about all kinds of experimental technologies and not so experimental technologies. We'll be having conversations like in movies like The Delivery Man. What happens when someone is the biological father of 200 people? What rights does he have? What responsibilities does he have? Most of these conversations, most of these situations, most of these industries have little to no regulation in the United States. Sooner or later, these conversations will have to happen. The more they become necessary, though, the more opportunity I think there is for alternative narratives to gain a foothold. Not anti-gay narratives, not turn back the clock narratives, but new ways of thinking about the issue that do a better job than the current restrictive narrative we're dealing with at balancing both larger social goods and societal needs with individual rights. So we need to understand why the narrative strategy worked, how our beliefs are shaped, the role that personal experience and social concepts play in this. I have to pay a massive, citation here because I owe a lot of my knowledge in the next 5 minutes of this conversation to my friend Nathan Hitchen, who last year published, with 3% of my help, a primer on marriage messaging, reviewing a lot of the social science behind how the conversation's been shaped in recent years, and what people who support the kinds of things that Ryan was talking about this morning, the kinds of perspectives that was talking about, can bring to the conversation, the ways that we can continue to have a productive conversation. So I owe Nathan a debt of gratitude on this one. Let's talk moral psychology for a moment. The way the moral mind works, the way the human brain works, as far as how we process beliefs, it's very much intuition's first, reasoning second. I'll say that again, intuition's first, reasoning second. Now, I majored in political theory, and in political theory, especially Catholic political theory, I am the bad guy for saying this. Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Locke, Kant, the cool people are all about reason and suppressing the passions. Anybody see Legally Blonde? The law is reason free from passion, from Aristotle. Yes, I just quoted that in a public place. There's a huge contrast, though, between this trend of thought and the Scottish Enlightenments, David Hume, Edmund Burke, some of the political philosophers that I greatly admire. Broadly speaking, the British Enlightenment versus the French Enlightenment. The British are a great deal more skeptical of human reason. They tended to think that reason is, to a large extent, in practice, the slave of the passions. I'm going to believe what I want to believe. I'm going to believe what my experiences, my social relationships, the cultural narratives around me, the literature I've read, in our case, the movies we've seen, have shaped my values to make me want to believe. And social science has largely vindicated not political theory, as the political theory narrative that you get in a modern American university, but the British Enlightenment in the form of disciplines like moral psychology. And the way it basically works, intuition's first, reasoning second. I can be standing up here making the greatest argument any human being has ever made on an issue, and if you are predisposed to disagree with me, in fact, if you think I am an evil person who is out to destroy your life, you are not hearing a word I'm saying. You're hearing warning, warning, bad, bad. Lights are going off before you have a conscious thought. Now, if you're a very evolved human being, you might be able to move past this and think, but your brain has already jumped in a particular direction before you've had a conscious thought. Second point with regard to the moral psychology issue is that our brains are hardwired for narratives and stories, much more so than they are for arguments. That's why fairy tales are so common with children. That's why all but the most mature people are so antagonistic towards people they perceive to be the bad guys in the conversation in question. Back to Disney, existing conservative appeals that I've heard, the legacy conservative organizations, the way they tend to approach these issues, they don't work in the moral narrative that my generation has. The warning bells go off. The good guys and the bad guys seem to be in the wrong places in this narrative. Marriage revisionists have been telling a story of liberation in which the sympathetic and the oppressed are overcoming the mean, evil oppressors. Villains lose in stories. Well, as Oscar Wilde said, the good ends happily, the bad unhappily. That's what fiction means. Well, that's why the talk of being on the wrong side of history sounds so obvious to people who are in favor of redefining marriage. And finally, emotion is actually a cognitive function. I see this a lot in political science, political theory conversations, this juxtaposition of emotion on the one hand and reason on the other. But emotion is actually controlled by the brain. It's something that is actually a part of our ability to process things. Prejudice, rightly ordered, is actually, I would argue, a very helpful thing. It's rightly ordered prejudice is what tells you, that's a guy with a gun coming toward me, I'm going to run. I'm not going to touch the stove, I burned myself once, I'm not going to do that again. Your brain has been prejudiced. You've rigged the game, biased your brain to know this is bad, this is good. Our emotions are these biases, the developed instincts that tell us it's dangerous, run away. So our brains tend to respond to things that have that emotional resonance from our own experience. Stories are one, but so are metaphors, images, even simple repetition. Love equals love. You hear something enough times from enough people, unless you're very, very strongly biased against it to begin with, it shapes your perception of reality. This is especially true if the idea has an emotional tug. I will get to Instagram, I promise. But there's another field here getting into this, and this is what I actually work with most often, and that's social network theory. I deal a lot with helping organizations transition from a model where they treat their voters or supporters as these isolated people, whether it's in a very rudimentary, I'm going to send you a fundraising letter once a year and then try to keep you off my back until I can send you a slightly larger one next year, or whether it's the very complex metrics that go into a lot of data-driven voter turnout strategies these days. But it's all very individual focused, but we're not individuals. We don't exist independent of relationships. And this is the other component of moral psychology, and that's the social element. The notion that if we hear something enough times from enough people, that's the other factor. It's another thing to talk about your internal brain. We also have to talk about your social brain, because our brains are social. We're embedded in real-life social networks, and these social networks shape our perceptions of good, bad, normal, abnormal, desirable, undesirable, and so on. What I perceive as good is going to be shaped very heavily by norms of what I see around me. And here I would actually go a little bit further than Timothy on the is tends to lead to should thing. I would say it is equals should in this conversation. I've seen this with a lot of voter turnout strategies. When the strategies are based around saying that someone should do something, they don't work nearly as well as when they simply say, communicate in some way, people like you do this. That's what we tend to ask ourselves when we make moral decisions. If it's really tough, and I'm at my wit's end, I'm going to think of somebody I respect and think, what would he do in this situation? I might not even consciously think that. I'm imagining in my mind. What would this look like if somebody who I'm sure would know what to do in this situation would do in this situation? What would people like me do? Our social networks tend to look like us as well. We tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. They also, in turn, shape us. We tend to be affected by those people who are around us. So a social network is a very, very powerful thing. We can end up in a situation where a narrative or an emotion is implanted in a social network by influencing one or two people. Next thing you know, the entire college community believes something because it's spread from one person to 5 people in his network to 5 people in their networks. As a result, your perception, the collective perception of reality is shaped. But you might notice there's a very restrictive element to this. People's networks, because we tend to make friends with people like us, they tend to be very polarized. At the very least, most people, at least 2/3 of their friends, believe the same general things they do politically. So your conceptions of right, wrong, normal, abnormal, desirable, undesirable, as well as the narratives and metaphors that provide a structure for all of them, are shaped by a group of people that's very like you. So there's very little diversity of influence in most people's lives, whether you're looking at a little village in red state Oklahoma or a neighborhood in Manhattan. Going to Princeton, I met a lot of people for whom conservative was something they'd read about in a book. They'd literally never met one before. In fact, with social networks, we can be affected by people 3 degrees of separation away. There have been all kinds of crazy, crazy experiments. They've figured out that things like if I convert to Catholicism or lose weight, I can affect not my friend, or not just my friend, but my friend's friend and my friend's friend's friend. It's pretty nutty stuff, the way that these things can spread. So ideas that are powerful, that appeal to a narrative that resonates with us, can catch on and spread through these nicely polarized social networks. A side note, self-described progressive social networks are actually especially polarized. Jonathan Haidt, I think he's at NYU now, used to be at UVA, has done some fun work where he's actually asked conservatives and liberals, self-described conservatives and liberals, to fill out ethical questionnaires, a bunch of questions, dilemmas, situations you might find yourself in, but he asks them to answer it as the other group. So he asks the conservatives, what would a liberal say in answer to this question? Do you push the child out of the way of the train and have the train crash as a result? Or do you kill the kitten? I don't know why you'd do that, but it was in some of the questions. And what he found was that liberals were terrible at accurately imagining conservatives' points of view. Their answers did not match what the conservatives actually said in these surveys. So they were crazily wrong, something like 70% of the time. So all of us, but especially those of us who live in places, I live in Colorado Springs, where liberals are something we read about, we're in these situations where our social networks, our relationships are echo chambers as much as anything else. So as far as that goes, all of this just rolls right into social media. I have all kinds of conversations about social media with whether it's a young startup company or it is a 30-year-old public charity with an established board and leadership. And we have a lot of the same conversations over and over and over about just how useful is this? Just how evil is this? Used to be we could go into a public place and have a conversation with people we didn't know. Now it's rude to have a conversation with someone next to you because they're on the phone, which used to be rude. So phones are evil. I actually read about this in the airline magazine on the way here. There was this social experiment from a self-described Luddite. I met one of these once. A self-described Luddite, hates technology. He actually spent a whole weekend putting away his phone and talking to other people everywhere he went. And apparently it did not go well. He learned some very interesting stories, but generally people considered him to be psycho. Oh no, I hope he's not going to talk to me next. But it's fascinating. Social media was invented by people my age. I was in college, same time Mark Zuckerberg was. He was at an inferior school, of course. But it's fascinating if you look at what millennials grew up with in terms of social arrangements. Even the notion of suburbia, the notion that you can have a place where you sleep that is geographically divorced from where you do everything else. Is a very, very new thing in human history. And in the conversations that I've had just today with people in my general age group, when I start talking about loneliness, when I start talking about isolation, heads start nodding. We don't really know what it means to live in community. We love the idea, but most of us have never seen it. And social media was invented not to destroy the world, not to force our grandparents to get on Facebook, but it was invented as a way of bridging that loneliness. You can have all kinds of conversations about whether it just made things worse or not, but the motivation, in a very large sense, was to take a situation where I am disconnected from the people who ought to matter to me most and can reconnect with them. If you think about, I love Jane Austen. I'll just say that in public as well. And one thing that you notice in any Jane Austen book or movie is that there's a lot of spontaneous interaction. People just bump into each other a lot because they're in small, confined villages usually where they know everyone. They bump into someone. They're going to have a conversation that wasn't planned. When I want to get together, my wife and I want to get together with some friends, we have to plan it 3 weeks in advance because everyone's lives are so overscheduled and booked that they don't have time to live them. Social media allowed some of that spontaneous interaction to get back into people's lives. Just read an interesting article. Hey, Joe, have you read this? It's almost like I'm at the gas station in Nowhere, Ohio, talking with the guys about the news that morning. Because of how social networks work, online as well as in real life, despite massive growth in quote-unquote globalization, mobility, your Instagram feed is still feeding you a narrative that's just as restrictive ideologically as the New York Times or, God forbid, Fox News. Yes, in some studies, a little under half of Americans say they support gay marriage, but in a lot of climates, you'd think it was 97%. I don't want to monologue too much longer. I want to see how many of you I've deeply offended and see where this goes. But I want to hit a few very, very practical takeaways. We can have all kinds of interesting conversations about social media, about where this goes, and I want to get into them, but I want to allow the conversation to be steered a little bit by why you're all in this room, besides the fact that you'd get to hear Sharif anyway. We're in a very early stage because we're really having this conversation at the tail end of the last quote-unquote fight. Hardly anyone is even leading a charge on the next one yet. But we're in a place where at some point in the near future, we're going to have conversations about what is marriage and all the legal ramifications and social ramifications of that in the context of some of the things that we've heard from other speakers, in the context of what about the kids, in the context of what about the technologies, what about the legal niceties, what are we trying to accomplish here? The larger question, what are we trying to accomplish as a society in terms of balancing the justness of our society and the cohesiveness of our society with individual liberties? We're going to have this conversation in a far less restrictive context than we have had it thus far, but we're not quite there yet. I've heard a little bit, actually a lot of it, today, and it's been very encouraging. But there aren't a lot of people having the kinds of conversations we've had today. So in the meantime, a few practical notes that I want to make sure I get in before the Q&A as far as the social media question and these larger questions of where is this going and how can we be productive contributors to this conversation. One, don't be the jerk who fights everyone on Facebook. Just going to say it. You're just Triton in The Little Mermaid, and you lose. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, I think, I was watching this clip of, I'm going to call Ryan out here, sorry, Ryan. A clip of Ryan on, I think he was on Fox News, and he convinced someone to support polygamy. Because he was reasonable, and he forced her to be reasonable and realize this is where her beliefs go. But rather than being scandalized, as I would argue she ought to have been, she said, you know what, you're right, I can't, polyamory, I can't argue against that. All right, I'll support that. Second is don't silo yourself ideologically, either in real life or online. It's very easy to take someone off your Facebook feed, your Instagram feed, just defriend them. You don't even have to do one of those purges I see people do periodically. I don't know why people do this. Periodically telling all their friends, I'm going to get rid of everyone but my real friends. And they tell them this. So that you don't have to read the boring or offensive things by the people that you don't agree with and don't like. That's a part of life. Let people who disagree with you gather real-life experiences from somebody who lives differently and soberly considers all the variables, especially ones that don't fit in with their narratives. Don't share aha links very often. 3 is develop your moral imagination. For those not familiar with the term, the moral imagination, it's a difficult thing to describe. I would tend to describe it as the ability to step outside yourself to consider an issue, the ability to look at an issue from the perspective of someone else, someone who has had experiences that you have not had. Also involves at a political level the ability to anticipate the unintended consequences of your actions or your policies. You can imagine how widespread a virtue this is in DC. You develop the moral imagination by reading lots of good fiction, watching excellent movies, finding good writers who disagree with you, reading them regularly. Bottom line, you don't develop this without regularly reading great books. Sorry, engineers. Fourth, recognize there's more and more pop culture that could set up next generation conversations. I already contrasted Frozen with The Little Mermaid. I could also mention The Incredibles or some of the other Pixar movies. Think about Batman Begins versus Aladdin. The message of Aladdin is that who you are is, to the extent that we want to say something has a message, is that who you are is something underneath, something to be found. I know people from college who are at 30 still on long voyages of self-discovery, which means they're on their 3rd degree and still haven't done anything for the world in terms of a job or an accomplishment, because they're trying to find themselves. I guess so far they don't like what they found. By contrast, you have Batman Begins, the message of which is it's not who you are underneath, it's what you do that defines you. That didn't resonate with what I got from Aladdin. Finally, pay attention to these next generation conversations. I'm happy to talk more about organizations that are doing interesting work in this field, publications to read. But keep an eye on what the outliers are saying. What narratives are your views and your language falling into?